Hello world, this is Brandon Wallace, and I am making my first video. Today I'm not going to talk about any current events or any topics of the day. As I've already said my piece on situations going on right now, we should have the Allied NATO forces get in NATO, the Allied NATO forces get Gaddafi out of Libya, and then the Libyans should send the Americans back home, and, everyone should help the Japanese, and, everyone should do their part to make the world a better, more humane place. And that's really all that I have to say about anything going on right now. And, but I do have topic that I would like to talk about in terms of contributing to public discourse and creating dialogue around progressive movement. I have here outlined what may possibly be my future dissertation and possibly a book. The title of it is Patriarchy and the Ties That Bind Race, Gender, and Sexuality. And I have it broken up into little chapters, and I'll go through each one and tell you about them. Chapter 1 is called Defining Patriarchy. In defining patriarchy, I go through the basic definitions of patriarchy that are given in society, and I talk about how the basic definition of patriarchy is gendered oppression is a bit narrow, and how it should be broadened to look at racial and sexual as well as class oppressions. But in this book I only deal with racial and sexual and gender oppressions. But how patriarchy should be, the definition of patriarchy should be expanded to look at racial and sexual oppression as well as gender oppression. So that's chapter 1, Defining Patriarchy. Chapter 2 is called Patriarchy and Race. In chapter 2, I look at how ethnic communities in the United States, and specifically the Afro-American community in the United States, has had to deal with over its existence in North America with what Bell Hooks terms white capitalist patriarchy. And I argue that the relationship between the African-American community and white capitalist patriarchy is, well, of course, it is a form of oppression. So I argue that we should look at this in terms of as another form of patriarchal oppression. On the other hand, I also argue that ethnic communities and other marginalized communities must do their part in terms of fighting patriarchal oppression, but that they cannot do so successfully until they give up their grasp on patriarchal power within their own right. That ethnic and other marginalized communities have not successfully diffused patriarchy because they have their own investments in patriarchy. So that's chapter 2. Patriarchy and Race. Chapter 3 is called A Shared Dilemma, Blacks in America and Edmund from King Lear. In this chapter, I address an idea that I developed in my junior year of college. I took this Shakespeare course, and we were reading King Lear, and it dawned on me one day that the dilemma that Edmund from King Lear that Edmund had in the play King Lear is the same dilemma that Afro-Americans, that black people in the United States have. And that is that Edmund, this bastard child, has to decide whether he's going to remain faithful and loyal to this patriarchal figure for whom he is a bastard and for whom he is not the first priority, or whether he will assume his own position in the world and determine his own way of living and mode of living in the universe. And I say that this is the dilemma of the African-American community, and that I make this argument very distinctly that the Afro-American also exists within the United States in the position of the bastard child, and that, like Edmund from King Lear, the Afro-American community must decide whether they're going to remain loyal and faithful to a white capitalist patriarchy for whom they are not the first priority and for whom they are the bastard child. And so that's chapter 3, and I look at sort of the parallels there between these two dilemmas and how they exist. Chapter 4 is called Patriarchy and Gender, in which I look at, I rehash the dialogue on gender oppression, and looking at gender oppression in terms of its varied existences in terms of communities of color, gender oppression of women of color, and that sort of thing. Chapter 5 is called Patriarchy and Sexuality, in which I argue that we must also look at the ways in which patriarchy expresses itself in the oppression of sexualized others, in terms of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered communities, and how patriarchy has a hand in the oppression and subjugation of those sexualized and othered communities. Chapter 6 is called Parallels, Gender, Sexuality, and Race, in which I look at the parallels between those forms of oppression. Chapter 7 is called The Confluence of Problems, in which I look at how people, at the new phenomenon of people who have more than one oppression, looking at disabled queer people, or looking at queer people of color on welfare, that sort of thing. So I look at those sorts of confluence of oppression in that chapter. And the last chapter is called Changing Society, in which I argue that we must come up with ways in which we can change the society. So that's this book, and that's my contribution. Thank you.